Gonna switch.
Hello and welcome to our Zession. If you are new here, we are so excited that you are joining us today. If you're joining again, thank you for coming back and thank you for being here and for your ongoing support. My name is Mandi Rourke, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in Austin, Texas. I support clients in Austin and all over the state of Texas. I'm also one of the co-founders of Zesho.
And I'm Dr. Sapna also a fellow co-founder of Zesho. And we're excited to welcome you back to Zessions, or welcome you to Zessions. Zessions are conversations amongst clinicians. We talk about topics that are typically addressed in the mental health world with the perspective of clinicians who support clients daily.
Yes, and today this is a very hot topic that we are diving into, which is navigating adjustments and transitions in life, which there's so much to this. This comes up in therapy all day, every day. It came up in my sessions even this morning, and it's just a constant. We know that change is a constant, and so we want to have this conversation today to talk through the ways that we process transitions, how we navigate transitions, and really just how we help ourselves through transitions, but also how we help others in therapy spaces for transitions too. So, assuming that you are a human listening to this, I'm sure you have experienced some transitions. So, we hope that this conversation today will be helpful for you to just have some perspective or some additional things to think about when it comes to your own adjustments that you have to adapt to in your lives.
Yeah, such a huge topic, such a prevalent topic in sessions pretty consistently. So really excited to dive into that. But before we do, our little bit of housekeeping here. If you do enjoy our content, please do consider liking, following, giving a positive rating and or review on any and all podcast platforms if you haven't already. Those ratings and reviews really help people find us and therefore can reach the people that will benefit from our content that we're trying to create for their benefit. So please do consider doing so. We really appreciate the support. Additionally, you can also follow us and connect with us on social media. We're at My Zesho on most all platforms, including Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. You can also find us at our website, which is zesho.com. So that's zessio.com. And at my Zesho is at myzessio.
Yeah,
Thanks for the support.
absolutely. So, as we do with every session, we always start off by getting really clear around what we mean or how we would define adjustments and transitions. So, let's just kick it off by getting into that of like when we say adjustments and or transitions, what does that mean? What does that entail? Even though this whole podcast is basically going to be covering what all it entails, which is a lot.
It is, but in the broadest sense, it's being faced with change, it's being faced with new events, new developments, um, shifts from because we as marriage and family therapists recognize that there's like this what we call equilibrium. So not to get too technical about it, but like this baseline that we usually try to maintain as much as possible. And these adjustments are things that tend to rock those, whether they're big or small. And you and I talked about it could be adjustments as small as like transitioning from task to task in the day, or bigger life events that we'll discuss examples of. And so we're focusing a little more on kind of life events type of situations today, but it's things that create new circumstances or additions that we don't necessarily have. We have tools in our toolbox, but we may not recognize them, or those tools need to be sharpened in different ways, or we just need new tools altogether to deal with them.
Yes, definitely. And, one thing as we were talking about transitions and just general adjustments, some of these you may be able to anticipate and kind of see them coming, if you will, that they're lurking around the corner, or maybe you're looking forward to this transition. We can't assume that all transitions are necessarily negative. They may be challenging, but they can be something that you anticipate, but they can also be completely unanticipated as well, kind of catch you off guard. It's like that rogue wave that hits, and you're like, okay, now I have to, like you were saying, find a new equilibrium in life. And that requires effort, but that also requires awareness that, like, oh, this is what I'm dealing with, because sometimes these transitions can happen very gradually. And again, as I was just kind of saying with the rogue wave, it's like they can happen very suddenly and really catch you off guard. And so we want to acknowledge that there is just a yeah, that's just kind of how it goes when it comes to life. And it's, again, I already used this quote at the very beginning, but it is constant. And if we can kind of talk through some of our personal examples today, we hope that that'll be helpful to recognize that you're not alone in this. And if you struggle with change, I want to start off this podcast by saying I am a person who struggles with change. I talk about change all day, every day, and I struggle with change all day, every day. And I'm just going to own that. So it's just part of being human, I think. Don't you think, Sapna?
Agreed. I am also someone who I think can handle change decently, or I like to think so, but it takes me a while to really make the adjustments. And again, that goes for everyday, like transitioning from task to task or life events. And so I'm definitely with you there. And absolutely, if you out there listening or any kind of similar, you are not at all alone. Even us as therapists who have been trained in, helping to create change and support change also have times that we struggle with change. And I think that is very much a normal part of the human experience. Um,
And it's on
yeah,
such a spectrum, right? Like it's big, it's small, it's sudden, it's
yeah.
gradual, it's.
Right. And there can be so many happening all at the same time of different, types too, or some of the same types, which if they're all sudden is like that much more stress inducing. And so just acknowledging like we're going to talk through this probably kind of in a little more basic sense to kind of help with maybe a new approach to understanding adjustments and transitions, but this is in the most basic sense, given that life does tend to be lifing and doesn't always just throw one transition or adjustment at us at a time. It tends to throw multiple.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you say that, because I do think it is like that ripple or domino effect of, like, if there is one change in one area of your life, it's not uncommon for there to be change or a transition in another area of your life that then you have to adapt to. So it can be overwhelming. Like I feel like I'm getting hit at all sides here, and where do I begin? And we hope that as we kind of talk through this and the fundamental sense, that it'll be helpful as we go. So maybe let's start off by just sharing some of the most, I don't want to say most common, but just some examples of life adjustments and or transitions.
Yeah, some frequent ones that people will often experience that may or may not be common across for everyone, but very common experiences. Um, Divorce can be a big one,
Mhm.
can affect families largely, and can also fall into the category of sudden or anticipated, depending on the situation and maybe even who each person is and their perspective. Um,
Mhm.
there's also uh, grief and loss of a loved one.
Mhm.
Um, Also can vary in how it happens and whether it's anticipated or sudden.
Well, and as you're
Um,
saying that too, just from like that systemic perspective, working with a lot of families and relationships with both of those, I mean, divorce and loss of loved ones, I mean, they're not the same, but there's similar components of the impact of that you're grieving. Again, maybe it's anticipated, maybe it isn't, but it doesn't just impact the one person either. It has such an impact on everybody that's within that system, be it the friend group, a family system, even like, co-working types of groups too.
Yeah, great point. And can really play into that the ripple effect that you were talking about before, for sure.
Mhm.
Um, there's also, oh, before I go into that, based on what you're saying, thank you for bringing that up because I was also going to bring up the concept of ambiguous loss. And I feel like we've talked about this before
Mhm.
in another pod, but I don't know that we've outlined it as much. But regardless, ambiguous loss is kind of it's grief, but over things that maybe not are not as concrete. And so I think a common example from the creator of the determined concept of ambiguous loss is um, when someone is missing in action and there's not as much the closure of being able to see them and say goodbye to them type of thing that can be considered ambiguous loss, but it can also be just like grief over things that you thought were going to go a certain way and they didn't. And that's like an expectation that you had for your life. So, for example, divorce. And there's a lot of grief there of what you probably anticipated for the rest of your future in your relationship and your marriage. Obviously grief of a loved one um is pretty that's not as ambiguous.
Mhm.
But there's also like loss of a job or career change that can definitely be part of an ambiguous loss, whether it's sudden or anticipated. Um, there can be that loss of um who you were and that like some pieces of identity that can be tied to that oftentimes that have to be let go, whether you want to or not, or you know the routines that you had, etc. And so just wanted to bring up that concept that's probably going to be underlying pretty frequently throughout many of these examples.
No, that's smart. And I think too, when we talk about changes here, whether it be a loss of job or job change, career change, I think that there's also like changes in, I mean, just like the people that you work with, right? Like it could be I have a new boss, or I lost my old boss, or I have new coworkers, or I change fields altogether and I no longer get to work with people that were close friends of mine. And so that's an adjustment that I have to confront as a person from like a social, but also like from a place of like where you might have felt secure in certain ways, right? You're like, wow, like I'm kind of having to gain my bearings at this new job and kind of understand like who are the people I can trust, because I used to have these people and now I'm having to like face like adapting to that new environment, which I think, one of the another major thing with change in environment was also like you're relocating, right? You're getting a new house. Like, maybe that's anticipated. Again, that can be unanticipated. Maybe you're having to move neighborhoods or states, cities, wherever it may be. And that's such a massive transition and adaptation too of like, the culture in this one space that I used to get very familiar and again secure with. Now I'm having to adapt to this whole new norm or all the new norms of a whole new place, which, at first glance, you're like, oh, I'm moving to a new part of town. It could be even in the same city. And you're like, wait a second, this is a completely different neighborhood that I'm having to even find out new roads and all of those things. So it's like, at the face value, sometimes I think these examples can almost be minimized in client experiences. Maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it's like, well, I just moved to a new apartment. It's like, well, yeah, but also, again, that impacts the way you go on your morning commute. That impacts the neighbors that surround you, the grocery stores you go to. So that like maybe the point is that every example that we're sharing here, we're already saying ripple effect, but it also just has so many different layers of impact that we have to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And also want to normalize like what might feel really easy for one person is, for example, moving. For people who have done it quite often in their lives or really accustomed to it, it's not that big a deal. But for some people who have been accustomed to being in one place for most of their life, haven't had to move that much, let alone maybe to like different states or countries or what have you, it's a really big shift. And so recognizing your own context and how it impacts you and not necessarily letting how it might impact other people and how they adjust and cope affect what you think your process should look like as well. Because there's also not necessarily always a time frame for expecting adjustment, or it's a continuous adjustment. For example, something that you'll talk about more here soon, Mandy, parenting and becoming a parent. That will take constant adjustment over, a lifetime. Similarly, getting married or being in a long-term committed relationship, having a partner that you're always going to be constantly growing and changing with. They're two different people who are growing in hopefully similar directions, but very individual. And that's always going to be a process as well that may not ever end as far as adjustments go. May stabilize, hopefully, but will probably continue to be a process of adjustment. Same with aging, for example, too. Like that's one that can definitely catch you by surprise. May or may not be speaking from the tiniest, itty bittiest beginning of experience.
I like that.
Um, but it that's one that can really be gradual to the point that you're like, oh, this is what's happening, and then this is what's starting, and then there's the anticipatory grief or anxiety that can play into it as well.
Well, and aging too, of like, I'm not a kid anymore, but I still kind of feel like a kid, but also I have a kid, but also I have a parent who is aging too. So it's like witnessing that shift too, where, when you are close with people, it is harder to sometimes see those changes, like you're saying. So it's like this gradual process of like, wow, like time is happening around me, and it does feel a little ambiguous at times, right? Where it is hard to like pinpoint sometimes some of the emotional experiences, which we'll get more into, of like what's going on with me? Why do I feel this way? And it's like, well, sometimes it's hard to pinpoint because of it being so gradual, and it's just so common too, right? Like part of living is aging. So it's like, do we really consider that a major life event transition, textbook wise? But really, yeah, we're all going through it in just different versions of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I love that example that you gave too of, you experiencing aging yourself, but also like having a kid who's also growing and aging, and also having parents who are growing and aging, and like the different layers, even just within that one scenario of like dealing with your own experience of aging while also supporting and fostering your kiddo developing and growing into the human that they're going to be, and also, supporting and me probably playing caretaker in some ways, oftentimes with parents and grandparents who are aging. And so, kind of dealing with that on multiple levels within our own families, within our own communities, can it be its own challenge for sure as well. And speaking of another thing that can often creep up on us or just be hard to pinpoint is just health issues or chronic illnesses generally, and kind of figuring out what they look like and how they're affecting us. And, that might shift as well based on what we're going through, or for example, for women can be impacted by their hormonal cycles. And it's just not a static thing that's necessarily easy to figure out how it's affecting us. And on any given day, is it flaring? Is it, a good day? I have more energy today, or it's a terrible, illness day, and I just need to stay in bed today. And sometimes you just never really know what you're going to wake up to, and having to kind of be prepared for everything is its own level of exhaustion, oftentimes.
It's like that revolving door of transitions, which I feel like we'll bring up again, right? Of like,
Yeah.
with one transition comes another transition. And I'm trying to think of what have we, this is kind of a more abstract one maybe, but I definitely have seen this in like transitions with people's identities when it comes to their belief systems too, whether that be like religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs, or just beliefs about anything really. And that being something that could happen with aging, it could happen with experiences, be it a day-to-day experience or even a traumatic experience, can shape you in different ways, where now you're adjusting to this new sense of self and identity, which can, again, going back to maybe sometimes we can anticipate, like, I kind of understand my process with this because I have enlisted myself in some spiritual enlightenment journey, or maybe it's something that like I've just gradually came upon as time goes on. And we're definitely going to be diving into some of the impacts of that too, because I think, there, if you yourself are changing and adapting, then systemically there are going to be impacts around like social and maybe even like family types of environments that can come up with that too. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also can vary how quickly and or how significantly those personal belief changes are as well. I've known some people who can like decide and like immediately make the shift, and that may sometimes have its own version of like whiplash. And for other people, it's like really, really gradual and really hard to like make that transition, but they know it's something that is helpful and they're striving towards, and but it's challenging to actually make that shift. um and then of course there's also things like changes in relationships,
mhm,
whether it's close friendships or family relationships, or or even relationships ending, dating wise or what have you. So not quite divorce but just breakups and the
mhm,
like. Those are definitely significant adjustments and changes,
mhm.
that it can be really hard to deal with because it comes with its own set of individual contexts and can also bring up, potentially unresolved or still resolving issues from previous relationships, or relationship losses or losses of a loved one, for example. They tend to layer very significantly, and makes it harder sometimes to kind of deal with and process through some of those losses of relationships as well. Um, and
Well,
then
and
there's
this
just
one, this kind of
yeah.
goes into career-ish, but also it's more around like financial impact too. Like there are shifts that people experience with financial stability slash security, and that could be due to just like transitions with starting school or ending school, or going back to I'm starting into the workforce and trying to like work my way up into more of like my kind of official job, if you will, or I'm retiring and I'm having to like adjust to a very fixed income or like an uncertain income, and not knowing how long that money is going to last and things like that too. So I mean, I think we're hitting on a lot of the main adjustments here, and but I know we're leaving some out because we're so complex and there are so many varied experiences that we work with. But these seem to be kind of like the main ones that I don't know that I know I work with a lot. Any others that we've maybe neglected to mention?
There's one that I'll go into a little bit more in detail. Of the one that I thought of when I thought of transition was um going back to school, going to graduate school. And for me it was after a couple years off from school, and so that
Right.
definitely helped add to the transition, but we'll get into that a little bit more. Anything for you?
Yeah, I don't really think so. I think maybe before we dive in, because we really wanted to share some of our personal examples today to bring some of these concepts into kind of the here and now, how this is and make it more conversational between Sepna and I, as far as like how we would kind of have a conversation with a client. Not that she's going to be my therapist or vice versa, but just some of those questions and things that we would consider with the client. And so maybe let's start by talking about the key aspects of adjustment. So it's like we've talked about, there are several different examples, but then we've kind of referred to it as like impacts of, but also we could say like aspects of adjustments to consider. And one, we've kind of hinted at some of this, of just like the grief being one of the emotions that is experienced, but there is such a sense of like needing to emotionally adapt to the change that you are being faced with. And so we're going to give some examples around how we've emotionally adapted or have been coerced to maybe emotionally adapt with some of these changes.
Yeah, and then usually there's going to be some type of shift in how you behave, what actions you take or don't take, what routines you may or may not follow, and how you kind of go about your life day to day, or even just longevity wise, like how you shift in your baseline essentially and how you act.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
It's, yeah, how you act, and it's also how you think or what you think, what you believe,
Mhm.
those cognitive shifts that are going to be very present with changes too, and that adaptation.
And then even socially, the adjustments that you have to make and the transitions that come with it. Are you able to keep the same support system? Are you able to have access to them? Does that access change? Does the frequency of your support change? Does the support system change entirely? Are you able to build a new one? Um, Amongst so many other things, how does your existing support system adjust to your transition that you're making? Do they adjust to your transition that you're making?
Right. Well, I think there's also just like logistical adaptations too of like what practically is changing in my life day to day. What looks different and what do I have to do differently to just navigate that change ongoing, because it's almost like I have to reconstruct the way that I used to live is just a little bit of a different version. And what are the logistical steps that I have to take in order for it to, again, like you first started off our conversation, get more into that equilibrium of like, okay, I'm finding some harmony now back into this, like finding that flow again when it was a little rocky before.
Yeah, and I mean, finding that flow, you're always going to be learning and figuring out how to actually make these adjustments and make these changes and develop in ways that these new experiences are challenging you to do, and develop the tools that you need in order to find a new baseline that you can create that feels more comfortable eventually, even if it's after a long period of time, but finds more stability essentially down the line. And so, what are the ways, what are the things that you learn and the tools that help you get there?
Mhm.
Um, so kind of these key aspects might have sounded a little abstract, and that's completely understandable. And so I think hearing us talk about it in the context of like the examples of transitions and adjustments that we've gone through might be kind of helpful.
Mhm.
And so, Mandy, what is the transition that kind of is a good example for you that you would be willing to kind of have us talk to you a little bit more about?
I would say becoming a mom, becoming a parent. As we were, we were talking about this before we got started, for someone who struggles with transitions, I had no idea how this transition of becoming a mom would look for me. I mean, I anticipated it because I had time to anticipate it, right? I was pregnant for some period of time and was well aware that a baby was on the way. And, it makes me think of this book, like, you're such a good mom before you become one, you feel like you have it all figured out. And then, but you just don't really know. You really don't know what that's going to look and feel like. And so I think that's the example I would love to unpack with you as my heart rate increases as I think about that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a common, experience for parents, and also looks different across parenthood and across which child we're adjusting to oftentimes. So do keep in mind your own context as you're listening. But yeah, there's so many different layers to it, and it's always an ongoing thing. But in becoming a parent and in continuing to be a parent, how has that transition affected you emotionally, will you say?
Okay, let's see. How do I describe? It has been the most layered emotional experience that I can think of, because for every challenging emotion, there is also like a rewarding emotion that happens all at once. I will never forget coming home with my precious little baby, right after giving birth and being like, "Well, now what? like absolute, like I read all these books and blogs, but I'm confused as to like how to actually apply it. Filled with an immense amount of anxiety and dare I say some slight panic around, how am I going to keep this sweet little human alive? And, the pressures of like, you need to feed this child and it's go time. That was a little that was really effing hard, let's be real. The pressures of that. And at the same time, like being beyond overjoyed, beyond like measure, and so grateful for this experience. And, as times would change and as she would get older emotionally, there's been just like different markers within that too of like, it's like almost with each stage there's been again something that's been incredibly positive, but then there's been something else that's been hard. It's almost like the definition of like bittersweet, right? Like, yay, she's 3 months old now and she's smiling, and so I'm getting this feedback and this is so wonderful, but oh gosh, she's already 3 months old. And so to be blunt, for someone who struggles with transition, parenting has been an absolute mindfuck, because every single day feels like a new day, but also like the most rewarding mindfuck of all time, right? Where I'm like, I would sign up for it again. Well, I didn't actually with another kid, but like theoretically speaking, yes. But I think emotionally, overwhelming would be a very good way of saying it, but also like not saying that overwhelming is all bad, right? Overwhelming in the sense of being able to have to like figure out how to hold all of these different emotions at the same time, where, you have poop on your face and at the same time she giggles in a way that you're like, oh wow, like I'm filled with disgust, but I'm also like, I've never heard her laugh this way. And like I've somehow holding all of these feelings at the same time. It's a lot. It was a lot. I mean, it continues to be a lot, right? At each stage of the game, as she continues to develop. So,
Yeah,
does that answer your
absolutely.
question?
Definitely. Very thorough. I appreciate it. And so relatable for so many people, even me, who's not a parent, but is enjoying aunthood, can
Yeah.
relate to some of that duality of like, oh my gosh, I love that they're growing and also like stop growing so fast. And like that's just the
Oh,
sliver as that I experience as an aunt. Like
my
I
gosh.
can only imagine the amount of duality that you're holding all together all at once as a
Mhm.
parent
Mhm.
on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis. So yes, thanks for giving that glimpse
Yeah,
into the
absolutely.
emotional experience of it.
Mhm.
And so I feel like that's a good segue into like how has that translated into ways you've had to change your behavior, the ways that you act, the way that you function essentially in becoming a parent because that's giant
Yes. Yes, it is.
to be the understatement of the world, but like
Yeah, this is like a hard one. I mean, it's basically like everything really behaviorally, I feel like changed for me, like in the way, but also like some things stay the same. Like it's not like me as Mandy as like a completely transformed human, but it's not just me anymore. Now there is this human that I love so deeply that I need to make sure that I am awake, I am alert, I am present, I am available to meet the needs of this other vulnerable human, even as she's gotten older. Like she's a little bit more, I mean, way more like independent now, but also she's not self-reliant completely. And so it's like, how do I or what I definitely have noticed is like transitioning from like I kind of have alarms set for me, like from the start. It was also like, the logistics of having to figure out like pump times or nursing times or what am I consuming and what am I doing with my body day to day. And all of that was massively different, even just in the ways of like, um, yeah, like how do I make sure I'm eating enough food where like sometimes you could skip a meal and wait till lunch, you know what I mean? Like just things where it was only like, this is just, I live my life for me. And so that's a big one. I mean, I could sit here and talk about behavioral changes with that all day long, but it's pretty much like everything.
yeah, it's like you're trying to maintain your own life and then also having to significantly orient and care for around this whole other person in addition to any other relationships that you have, like not to mention your spouse or your parents or your siblings or anything like that. and maintaining all of them all together. Yeah, that makes sense that it's pretty much everything.
Yeah, I think it's everything. Yeah.
Yeah. What about the ways you think, the ways that you thought, the thoughts that you have, continue to have? How's that shifted as you've become a parent?
Man, I was preparing for this. Like I was like, oh, I'm just gonna write down a couple notes and it'll be easy. And now that you're asking me, like I'm thinking there's so much around identity here. For me, there was a lot around like shame as a person. Like, am I doing this right? Am I good enough as a mom? Maybe that ties in a little bit with emotional impact too, of like the guilt of being a mom and like finding balance around like just being my own independent human while also having someone who is dependent upon me. I think, yeah, a lot of thoughts around, am I doing this right? And also just like from existence, that's where it kind of hit deep when you asked that question right now of like, like my entire life of like how I believe about what it means to be human completely changed after creating a human. Right now, I'm like witnessing this other human take her own shape and live her own life, and that does like bring about so many more thoughts about like the levity of living and what that means, and how do we want this to look and feel, and how do I want to create a life for her that will be like rewarding and safe and secure. And so a lot of thoughts. A lot of thoughts come up, and I don't know if those will ever go away. And I don't really want them
Or
to,
not.
but
Or not.
also, yeah.
Right. Just a really great example of like an ongoing shift that
Absolutely.
probably will be an ongoing transition in the way that it forms and the thoughts that you have and similar lines and threads, but will always be there as
Yeah.
long as you are a parent
Yeah.
and beyond.
Mhm.
But yeah, lots of juggling of like the responsibility and intentionality, it sounds like too, of like, how I want this to create a life that's fulfilling for, my child as much as I can, as much as in my control. It's a lot. It is a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
What about socially? How is the impact of becoming a parent? How's that had an impact on you socially?
I mean, it was pretty major for me. I feel like not only was it like social in the sense of, as you think like typical social groups of like friends, there were some friends of mine that had children already, and so some of that was like really positive and really helpful, but then there were other friends that we had that the way that their parenting styles were like we didn't really like jive with like how we wanted to like spend our time or how we wanted our time to feel when we were in the presence of other people. So there were definitely like shifts when it came to friend groups a little bit around like which friends do I feel like really good and held by when it comes to being a mom because of that shift in identity. Which friends just are like that the soul feeding ones. So I think like socially I definitely noticed a lot of shifts there, especially like there were shifts with friends who didn't have kids, and there were challenges for me too, where like I remember from the start, like there were a couple of friends that didn't have kids, and I was like, man, look at them living that free, carefree life. And like there was envy a little bit, which was surprising because it's like I wanted to have a kid. I still want to have a kid, right? But I also remember there being like going back to that grief of like, man, like, and the envy of like, it must be nice to just be able to do what you want whenever you want. But also there were some friendships that were kind of lost too, because it was like it didn't feel like there was as much of like joining me because there was like a lack of relatability or like, desire to be living in that same lifestyle. And I think that's pretty typical when it comes to that, whether it be you're losing friends because they don't have kids, or it's a change in friendship, or it's like, you have, like I kind of already said, but you have friends that it shifts the dynamic because the parenting vibe is different and doesn't feel very nourishing. But then I also think about socially when it comes to like relationship speaking too, of like, it has called upon my partner and I to be really thoughtful about like how do we make sure we have time for ourselves and just our relationship? How do we make sure that in addition to like carving out time, I always talk about this with clients too, of like we want to have time for our romantic relationships. We want to have time for our relationships with ourselves and what we're doing to have like that independence and that self-focus, but then also having attention on the family of like, in our case, like the three of us, like how are we, and you can't perfectly balance it out, but like how do we ensure that like, there is that adaptation of like, it's not just like me and my husband anymore. It's like me, my husband, is the three of us, right? But also like there's kind of like these different like subsets of relationships that we need, and also like just me and my daughter too, right? Like how do her and I have our own little time and bonding and things like that. So there's a lot of considerations with social things, even just like the things that you do, and maybe I'm kind of jumping ahead with that, but yeah.
Yeah, well, let's go there. Like the
Yeah.
things that you do, what are those kind of like logistical things that really shifted in parenthood? What are some of those like practical things that you kind of had to adjust or get used to adjusting to?
hmm I mean, I think work was a big one, like changing work schedules to accommodate the needs of caring for her at home. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, which was a whole other thing that I think many experienced.
Mm, yeah, just a
It's not
little
a
bit.
joke. I shouldn't joke about that. I'm not, but that was a massive practical dilemma of like, like just logistics around safety and caring for the well-being of her development, making sure she was cared for in a safe environment. I think for me too, personally speaking, like I love travel and I'm like, I don't want to lose travel. So that was one of those things where I'm like, in this transition of adding someone to my family, that is something that I will not lose. And I refuse like that. She's going to be our little traveling buddy from the start. And, thankfully, like because of that preparation and like commitment to that as a value of mine and my husband's too, that's something that we are practically able and we continue to like make part of our lives. But like that doesn't mean that like all those flights have been great. We've definitely been the ones on the plane that people are like, are you kidding me? But those are just like shifts around like the logistics of even like, I mean, just time, like time and money and planning. And there's so many different facets of that, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, there are lots of facets.
Mhm.
But I appreciate it. Sounds like they were very helpful in how you were able to kind of learn and develop kind of as a person, as a parent. And
Mhm.
so what are some of the ways that you do feel like you are the biggest ways, because I'm sure there's so many, but the biggest ways that you've developed and the biggest things that you've learned in that transition?
I would say that we are constantly transitioning. So if I constantly am expecting that things are not going to be the same, that then helps me feel more steady in being a parent because I'm like, yeah, like I mean, her favorite color was pink and now it's not. Now it's blue. Tomorrow it could be purple. I mean, that's such a small example, but it's like learning how to like anticipate that like each and every day truly is a new day. But then I think the other part of that is I remember one time, I was reading blogs around like nap times and different things like that, and like food and like all the, specifics around like how to raise a baby. And I remember just stressing completely out because my kid was not following the typical protocol with any of that stuff. And my mom was basically like, who is they? Like, who do you keep referring to as like they do this or they say this and that? And so the biggest learning and development I think within me was like, really, my own mom still teaching me saying, like, you need to like look within yourself and like trust your own intuition and like look at your daughter and like what is she telling you she needs? And so I think it was like a massive shift within my own life of like learning how to like trust myself and like that's gonna make me cry, but like trust my own intuition. Because I think
Yeah.
that that's something that before you're like, there's a certain way of doing this, right? Like I read all the parenting prep books, but like, no, like that's not based on your own kid. So like learning to trust instinct and to trust like what's right there in front of you in the here and now is like really powerful.
Yeah, truly. And like feeling settled in that feeling, because it's so antithesis to the messages that parents tend to receive on a regular basis of like
Mhm.
there's one right way of doing this, and if you're not
Yeah.
doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. And that's the opposite, is the exact opposite. And so like I can feel how powerful that is for you to kind of really step into um that confidence of like I get to choose and I get to make the decision based on me and my kid and my family and like our own unique circumstances and what we feel is right based on our values and what we have as our
Mhm.
hopes and dreams, and like
Yeah.
doing a phenomenal job
Oh,
just from the
okay.
sidelines.
Thank you.
um
It's no joke. It's like it's a big transition, but it's also one where it's, maybe I'm way jumping ahead, but like that is kind of like the reframe, right? Like as Glennon Doyle says, we can do hard things and change is really hard, but at the same time, like there's so much that is gained with it, right? Even navigating kind of those more challenging waters, like, the hope is that you can kind of find yourself feeling more like sturdy and like just swimming back to shore kind of feeling.
Yeah, all adjustments and transitions are lessons in resilience, and I think parenting is a constant reminder of just how resilient you are, even when you don't feel like you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. Totally. Oh,
Um,
thank you for asking me all those questions because I
course.
think it's a really good way of almost having a glimpse for everyone who's listening to see like these are, we did it more like kind of interview style, if you will, right? But like these are the types of questions that like I could hear you in session asking a client and just really like let's talk about this. Let's unpack this to help you really like shine a light on the fact that like there are so many different areas of impact when it comes to this. And I've thought about this a million times, but even you just asking me these questions, like in some ways right now, I'm like, yeah, like I'm a mom, y'all. Like I've done it. It helps like affirm the process of adaptation, I think, which there's just I think a constant opportunity or I think for people to be able to do that for themselves too of like look at all this that I have done and look how many layers there are to this, which makes me want to ask you some similar questions.
I
Are you
appreciate that. And I
ready?
also just want to
Yeah.
appreciate that. I love that that's kind of what takeaway, and I hope that can be similar for anyone out there listening who can ask themselves similar situations, sorry, at least some similar questions, or like have a loved one in your life ask you similar questions too, because I
Mhm.
anticipate that it just opens up a lot. And so let's see if it opens up more for me, maybe.
Yeah, let's go. It's game time. Sapna, you ready for this? Oh,
Um, so
so
yes, the
yeah.
transition that I thought of to give a
Mhm.
little extra context here, beating you to your question, I'm sure. I
I like
apologize.
it. Good.
But the big transition that I thought of was starting graduate school. And I'm mostly thinking of it in the context because I am privileged slash crazy enough to have gone to grad school twice, but mostly thinking of it in the context of going for my master's program. And so for background, I have lived in Austin since I was 3, and I went to UT Austin for undergrad. So I'd only been in Austin for a vast majority of my life, minus the first 3 years. And um, then I decided to go to graduate school at Abilene Christian University. And those who are unfamiliar with Texas, that's a smaller town in Northwest Texas. And for me, I think I knew I needed the change and the shift away from Austin. And in my mind, Abilene was like as different as you could get from Austin while still being in like a same quote unquote like city and like bigger city, bigger town, not in like a rural area necessarily. Big might be a strong word for Abilene, but I think it is growing. um, and yeah, and so I headed there for my master's in marriage and family therapy after a break from school for 3 years, which is when I met you, which is one of the biggest blessings.
Yeah.
And so I was, yeah, 2.5, 3 years I was not in school and then had to transition back into it and move to a different city and all that fun stuff. So
Oh, man. So I
a little
imagine emotionally there were some impacts there. What did you, I mean, if you could pinpoint some of the main like emotional layers that you experienced, what would you say really
yeah, I
was?
think it was a lot of the fears of the unknowns, and especially amplified by like that really felt like my launching. I know like they usually say college is your launching, but I think because I was still in Austin and I still like really relied on kind of the more established support system. I had a lot of friends from high school who went to college, the
Mhm.
same college as me. My family was still in Austin, and I saw them a lot more frequently than they probably wanted me to. Then that was like my launch, like my true like leaving the nest, and I knew I needed it, and I was grateful for it, but also it was terrifying to start it, and also in a city that's culture was very different from the one that I grew up with in, even though it was still in Texas. But Austin, if you don't know, you probably do, is pretty different from the rest of Texas. And so, especially being a woman and a woman of color going to a place that is was historically a little more on the conservative side and definitely very prominently Christian, and I personally am not Christian.
Mhm.
And so that was another like shift that I purposely was taking on and chose this program for that reason as well. Of like, I want a different experience. And it's also a very strong program and gives a lot of great training. But
Mhm.
there was a lot of that kind of fear and anxiety of like, will I find a place that I belong? Will I um, really fit in? Will I be able to be successful? Will I just be surviving this whole time, or will I find ways to thrive? Just kind of those unknowns
Mhm.
were definitely adding to anxiety. And there was, of course, excitement too, because I was like accepted into this fantastic program and able to follow my passion of becoming a marriage and family therapist, which I was very lucky that I felt very set on and like had a good foundation around,
Mhm.
thanks to prior experiences. And so it was a mix, but again, kind of like you were saying with that, with parenting, there's that duality, and that's like
Mhm.
never easy. It takes up extra energy, I feel like, to really hold both of those at the same time.
Yeah. How did it feel when you moved there, emotionally speaking? Like once you started to get kind of settled?
It was kind of tough actually. Because it was like logistically going back to having a roommate, but also like living on my own and far away from family as well, and like had none of my network or safety net in that area at all whatsoever. They were all a minimum of 3 hours away.
Mhm.
And so that was definitely nerve-wracking for sure. Um, and definitely like doing the adulting things all over again and like totally on my own, which
Mhm.
wasn't so different from what I'd experienced before, but in some ways it still was. And yeah, like balancing all of that with all these different new responsibilities,
Mhm.
that was just a whirlwind in and of itself. But yeah, and then also just a little bit of additional precaution that I felt like I needed to take as like I don't know how everyone in this area feels about,
Mhm.
people who look like me. And luckily never experienced anyone or anything that made me feel like I was different or othered in
Mhm.
that way specifically. But I was a little on edge about it. This was also, for additional context, this was also 10 years ago that I made that move. So
Mhm.
um I think politically and geographically it would probably look a little bit different, more than likely,
Mhm.
in more recent times. And I probably would have thought thrice or 5 times before actually taking that plunge,
Mhm.
and moving to somewhere like that.
Even just
For
like, I
those
mean, around
reasons.
emotional safety and just general safety too,
Exactly.
right? Of
Yep.
like,
Yep.
how can I feel like at ease when I know that there are like valid fears and risks there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not to say that it's um there's anything concrete that that was based off of, but just an
Mhm.
inherent need to protect
Sure.
and be on guard a little bit.
Mhm.
Yeah, inherently is there.
Well, and maybe that being a pretty big adjustment from not having felt that in your own kind of hometown with the community that you were, I think, feeling safe in, sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, overall, definitely. I mean, I would still say Austin is pretty predominantly white as well, but there, at least when I was growing up, had been a pretty solid emphasis on like valuing diversity and embracing it. And I also had, still like a big support system of people who also looked like me and were from the same culture, as well as who didn't, but also had the same experience of,
Mhm.
being a person of color in a predominantly white area.
Mhm.
And going to this program, I did acknowledge like I was the diversity there,
Nice.
and I went into it knowing that too, and wanted that experience, but
Mhm.
um, was glad that it was 2 years.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Well, so how do you feel like when you were in Abilene and you were going through the program that maybe you acted or behaved differently during that time?
Um, that's I'm you're right. I'm experiencing the different. I'm thinking of so different things than I had thought of
Mhm.
before.
Yeah.
Um, I think it was actually an opportunity to embrace a new part of my identity and development. And
Mhm.
I was excited for that, especially because I already knew at that point that I was very much a nerd about MFT,
Mhm.
marriage and family therapy, and the field. And so I think largely it was um I found myself trying to become like the best version of me that I could. And um being a student is not the easiest for me, honestly. It's pretty challenging for multiple reasons, but I was trying to embrace it and just follow the passion as best I could. But there's so many different hats that you have to wear as a graduate student, especially as a graduate student in a clinical program. You're going to classes, and then luckily ACU has a really cool, their in-person program has a really cool transition of how you are slowly is eased into becoming a therapist and like actually seeing clients. But that is a slow process that you do have to like kind of work your way into, and is its own kind of nerve-wracking, and then the admin that comes with it. And
Mhm.
um I was also working as a student worker position as well, and um it was a lot to juggle. And so yeah, I think just trying to figure it all out, and time management is not my strong suit and wasn't back then either. And so it was tough to figure out how to juggle those things. And as I say that, I know I'm still struggling with juggling all those things, but it was also one of those where like you don't have the time to figure out how you do it, you just do it.
Have to do it. Yeah. Well, so how did that impact kind of your thoughts and beliefs about yourself, like from that cognitive perspective?
Yeah, I think there was a whole lot of imposter syndrome. And I think that's pretty normal in any graduate program, especially one that's clinical. But that was a pretty constant process. And I was also really lucky that I had really fantastic professors and supervisors who were very, very affirming and would also like really go out of their way to point out like great things that I was doing, whether it in being classes or in sessions or what have you. That really helped. But I found myself constantly kind of battling like, am I doing this right? Am I doing enough? Like, am I, you know, effective enough? Am I helping enough? Am I, able to utilize the few tools that I have in my my toolbox so far in being a therapist, and like being able to actually make a difference for these folks who are often driving from long distances to come to our clinic. And yeah, there was a lot of that, in addition to just kind of getting used to the flow of school again. I know 2.5 years probably doesn't seem like a long time, but even that much time off from
Yeah, yeah.
being in school for full time is kind of a hard transition back into. And so
Mhm.
it is a lot of changes all at once, as many transitions tend to be. Grad school is not an exception to that for sure. And so definitely having to like make sure I'm thinking um recognizing, like, kind of taking the lead of those who I was really lucky to learn from, of like, okay, I am doing these great things. And like, even if I'm not seeing the results directly, unfortunately, as therapists, we don't always get to see the results directly, but we just gotta hope and trust that the work that we're doing is some kind of helpful. And if it's not, that I get to learn from that and become a better therapist for the future as well.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting as you were talking about that experience of like the imposter syndrome too, of like, maybe that's not shared amongst like everybody, but I know it is shared amongst the two of us where it's like, okay, this is something new, this is something different, and almost like that the default thoughts are like, am I doing this right? And
Mhm.
that can be such a common thought of like, am I doing enough? Like, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? Right. And it makes
Yeah.
sense, right?
Yeah.
As you're sharing that, I'm like, well, yeah, like of course you're gonna ask yourself those questions of like, it's new.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to know exactly how to do it, but those definitely feel like thoughts that were pretty common, but also ones that it sounds like you had the ability to look, for the feedback from others to be able to kind of help navigate that transition too, of like, well, here is feedback around the things that are going in the ways that they need to. So that helps kind of like give more fuel to just that adaptation of this new environment altogether.
Yeah, 100%. And I recognize kind of bringing in that thread into the second round of grad school that I went to for my doctoral program. That didn't go away, and we had multiple conversations, even as doc students, amongst our cohort, that were actually really helpful, of just recognizing like the imposter syndrome's gonna be there for a long time, and like it's kind of an adaptive thing, I think, of like we care about this, and so we're wanting to make sure that we're doing the job that we are supposed to be doing, or the best job that we can, but also like relying on the feedback that we're getting, and trusting the people who are supposed to be guiding us, of like, if they say that what we've done is enough and it's good, trust it. And if they say that, no, there's a little more that you got to do here, there's more work that's to be done, like get on it, then go for it. And just humbling ourselves a little bit more to recognize, like, let's just go by what they say. They have been doing this for a minute, they're experienced, they know what direction we need to go in, and trust their guidance. And like that's also kind of challenging too, especially if you're used to being in control of your own like um process and what you need to learn, and kind of having your own standards that you set for yourself. It's its own challenge for sure, but
Definitely.
um, yeah, yeah.
Well, you've kind of hinted at some of this, but for the sake of talking about some of like the practical adjustments that you had to make, like what are some other like logistical shifts that you had to adjust to when it came to the move and or grad school?
Yeah. Again, getting used to a different city, where when I first moved there, I didn't know anyone. And luckily, grad school, you have built-in people that you get to know and kind of form relationships with, and I'm grateful for that. But of course, being there for the first time and not knowing anyone at all whatsoever is its own form of intimidating, and kind of allowing that time and space for those relationships to develop kind of organically without necessarily forcing them, and really getting to know people and see, who you really mesh with organically as well. And luckily, I had a pretty great cohort, both my own, the one above me, the one below me.
Mhm.
And so it was pretty easy to get along with them, but
Mhm.
also recognizing there's different walks of life. And so just also getting used to the routine of it all, which is not the easiest, not my forte, and having to usually adjust it from semester to semester, especially as we started to take on seeing clients. That is its own change as well. Again, luckily, the program structured it, so you kind of anticipated how that was going to happen, so that helped a little bit. But um, again, for me, transitions are not the easiest. And so it usually would take me at least a couple weeks before I would really get into the rhythm and the flow of things each semester. And then it felt like that was halfway through the semester at that point. And like you just get your bearings
Yeah.
straight and then shifts on you all over again.
Mhm.
So
But it sounds like socially, like it was almost like a built-in social support system. So that was a helpful part of your like adjustment there of like you have other people that are going through this alongside of you.
yeah, yeah. Luckily it was that. And luckily, again, I had a really great cohort that um I was easy to kind of lean on them a little bit and really share that experience. And I think I tried to like voice some of the challenges that I would face so that it would give opportunity for other people to voice if they were having similar challenges and just normalize like that this is a really hard process and
Mhm.
um it's not easy and you're not alone in it. Like we're all going through it together as much as possible. And I do think that that helped, but it was definitely its own kind of vulnerable process. And also just allowing time and space for relationships to develop to the point that like you can really trust them and know that like you can share things with them and that they give a shit, but also like they're a safe place to do it.
Another
And
adjustment.
yeah, yes,
Right. Of like the
exactly.
transition time of like, I now trust you. Okay, this feels different
Yeah.
versus when I first met you. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We're
Mhm.
still strangers. We don't know if we know each other like that, but
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah, definitely its own process. And then kind of meeting new people within the next year and taking on more of a leadership role when you get into your second year. So then you have like a co-therapist from the first year cohort and taking on those roles as well kind of shifts too. But again, luckily they're pretty phenomenal humans in that cohort too. And I was lucky to have some co-therapists that were really, really great. So,
Mhm. Well, even
um,
with that, I would imagine that there was like a lot of learning and like skill development that you were faced with like not only becoming a clinician, right? And, working with clients for the first time, but then also like what you're just referring to, like you're helping other, emerging clinicians. So what else would you kind of share that was like part of your development or you had to like skill learning? I'm sure there's a million things you could cite here.
there's definitely a million things for sure, which is such definitely part of the most like enriching part of that process. And one of the things that I like most about being a therapist as well is like y- you're always being pushed to become a new and better version of yourself. Not to say that the version of you that isn't enough, it is, but also like the more that you learn and grow, the more beneficial it is to the work that you do, and the depths that you can support, your clients in achieving. And I definitely think it helps set us up for that really well as far as development goes. Um, I think it also gave me confidence and kind of being able to handle everything on my own and um knowing that I could do it even if I didn't have my established safety net and network, and I could create a new one and, find a lot of joy and support within that and also handle things myself. I will also say, like, my second year was probably one of the most stressful times in my entire life. I was doing so fucking much. And I will say that's including my doctoral program. And maybe it's because I did that much in my second year that it felt like I was capable of doing it in my doctoral program a little bit easier. Who's to say? But it was one of the roughest times for sure.
Mhm.
Because I was just stretched so thin and doing so much and wearing so many different hats and having so many different responsibilities. Um, but I did it.
You
I did it and
absolutely
I
did
got
it.
through it.
Dr.
Right.
Sapna, right? But also, I just think that, as you're describing like all of the different responsibilities, it's like within each new responsibility that then has like all of these layers of transitional, like the aspects that we're talking about right now. So it's
Yeah.
like you like, and I mean, I don't want to repeat myself, but there's just so many different facets of like, okay, now that I'm taking on more of this like mentor role, I need to focus on what that means from like what does that feel emotionally for me? What does that then like change with my process of like how do I navigate such? I mean, it's just there's so much that you then have to like it opens up these other doors of like now I'm going into the unknown here, into the unknown here, into the unknown here. And as I say that, it's like, it is naturally very overwhelming, but it's also something that like as you're sitting here saying like it was hard and it was rough, like some of the roughest years of my life, but like here I am saying I did it and it was possible, right? And I think that's where, maybe as we don't have to jump ahead just yet, but it's almost like what's the magic formula of actually like navigating all of these aspects, because there's so much to consider, it's not
Yeah.
so simple of just being like I'm going through a transition and these are the aspects and the end. It's like there's like processing that's involved within each of these steps too.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many layers all at the same time, just like you said. So it is so complex. And like both of the examples that we gave happen to be ones that were anticipatory for the most part. I mean, I think there's also just the unknowns within each of those anticipatory ones that,
Sure.
are their own struggle and twofold, fivefold for transitions that are not anticipated and that are sudden and blindside us, or we don't realize are happening until we're in the middle of it.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think there's so many layers there, and there's so many different factors that people experience. And so, physical health, for example, during all those transitions and that second year when I was stretched to my thinnest, like my physical health, I think, deteriorated pretty significantly.
Sure.
And I
Yeah.
experienced that towards the end of my doctoral program as well, or throughout periods of my doctoral program. And hell, I'm experiencing it now that I'm finished too.
Right.
And it's, things like that that continue.
Well, I think it's good for you to bring that up too, because we just kind of shared our own personal examples of like these are the transitions that we went through that were major in our lives that we still have impact from in many different ways, I'm sure. But there's also just I think room for us to talk about like other impacts, right? Like within that, there's we've touched on financial, physical health, anxiety, uncertainty. I think that there's this whole what do you call it, like a diagnosis that is like the adjustment disorder, which I don't like saying it like that, so I'm like, what do we really want to call it here? But I want to say that out loud because I think that it's helpful to acknowledge that like so many people when going through an adjustment struggle with depression, with anxiety, with having mixed moods, which having like a lot of self-doubt, and there can be major strains on themselves individually, but then also on families too. On, did I say finances yet? So it's like as we keep thinking about that, I mean, adjustments, as beautiful as they are when we get through them, while you're in it, it can just feel like you're just like sludging through mud, and like how much longer am I gonna have to like tread water here? Um, and I'm curious, are there any other challenges that maybe we should identify that people commonly experience with transitions that we haven't really touched on in our own examples here? We talked about time management being really
Mhm.
tricky, family strain,
Yeah.
changes within that.
We talked about skill gaps too, of kind of learning new skills that you have to develop and kind of on the fly as well. Um,
It's also just like the sadness and the depression piece of this is real,
yeah,
right? When
yeah, the
things
mental health
change,
piece.
it's hard. It's like, like, one thing we were going to kind of touch on too was like unanticipated changes where it's like a sudden loss of job. Um, it can completely like disorient you, right? Of like, here I was like living my life, feeling steady in what I'm doing, maybe not loving every single day, but I mean, I've worked with a lot of clients, especially in these times right now, where it's like out of the blue, they're being met with a layoff, and it's like these feelings of like a lack of worthiness or rejection of like these feelings of like I am being eliminated, and like the depression and sadness that can really be so heavy within that. And even as I'm saying that, I'm like, I think even when you get promotions, that's unanticipated. It's like, yay, but also there's more work involved sometimes. And that can even cause like depression. And it feels really confusing to be like, wait, this positive thing in my life is actually causing like an interruption in my mood and the way that I feel. Or like now again, I'm, faced with people that I don't really know in this work group, or I have a new boss, and maybe positive changes are down the line, but it's so incredibly common for there to be high levels of anxiety, whether that be again with you as a person or within the whole system. And I'm pointing that out day in and day out of like, hey, let's ride this horse through, but let's know that it's going to be bucking in every single direction, and just like hold on and just know that like, that like wild ride is part of this. And if we can just say that, let's expect that your mood is going to probably suffer, your physical health might suffer, right? Like illness around just like having to like push full force through a transition, and then be like, whew, okay, finally I got through it. And now I'm sick because I spent all of my resources on getting through that. Um, so what else would you add to that?
Yeah. I think especially with those unexpected circumstances like being laid off, I think, excuse me, there's yeah, dealing with like the social stuff as well, like how it impacts your family, how you're able to relate to your family, relate to people outside of your family and your support system. There's a sense of kind of pride and shame that plays a role in there oftentimes too. Not to mention, like, again, the logistical pieces too of like, if my friends and I usually like go out and go to dinners and stuff to connect, like I can't do that at the moment. How do I connect with them? I don't want to put them out and be like, "Hey, I can't do that. Can we do something else?" They may or may not be willing to. It can really impact that part of you as well, and the overall stress of your loved ones as well, and kind of those relationships, and maintaining those and navigating those together while you're kind of dealing with it in your own way, and kind of
Mhm.
your significant other might be dealing with it in their own way. And each of the ways that we deal with stress can be very different, sometimes in conflict with each other. Day-to-day changes as
Mhm.
well, what we can maintain as our lifestyle versus what we can't, how quickly I'm able to find a new job, how much time and investment that takes,
Right.
how much my mental health allows me to deal with that.
Mhm.
Um, and then if there's other things that I got to go learn in order
Right.
to get a new job, and
Exactly.
learn from this experience, even of
Mhm.
like, were there things that I could have controlled? And sometimes there's not.
Right.
Sometimes it is absolutely not in your control. You were doing everything you were supposed to be doing, and it still happened, and it sucks.
Well, and
Genuinely.
I think that's part of like, the resentment that can come with change, or the resistance that can come with change too, of just like, I didn't ask for this to happen, but now I have to deal with it. And that's also just part of processing the adjustment too, of just being able to acknowledge that. So I think maybe as we're kind of starting to wind down our conversation here, it may be helpful to go into, I don't want to call it like a formula, because I don't think there's a perfect formula around navigating this, but for the lack of a better way of saying it, it's like, what is the process or a way to handle the transition? I think, as we're already kind of talking about this, is it's first we have to recognize that a transition is happening. And sometimes it's almost like, if I am noticing like a change in mood, or if my client is reporting back, like things are off, I feel like chaos, or just like this, I feel unsettled, that, it's being able to use those emotions to help kind of inform like, well, what could be contributing to this state of unease? And oftentimes it's like, what changes am I going through right now that were maybe anticipated or maybe weren't? And so it's just starting to number one, recognize that maybe I'm going through a transition here, and it may be a small one, it may be a big one. But to try to recognize that is this gradual? And maybe that's why this is kind of like that slow burn, or, maybe I don't really know what's happening. And I just, maybe it goes back to kind of like that aging example of just like, man, like I used to be able to do things that I once was able to do. And now it's like really hard for me to go play tennis like every single day. And, as an example of like, that's something that, wow, it's kind of this thing is like taken from me type of feeling. And I am having to adjust to that. And so getting really curious is always like a good starting point to recognize like, am I going through some sort of transition? And I bet like oftentimes you could probably find something that is transitioning because again, change is the only constant.
Yeah, absolutely. And we offer this not again as a formula, but just as maybe a little bit of structure to be able to kind of take a step back and see what you're dealing with. Because so often when we're in these kind of time periods of transition and adjustment, especially when so many of them tend to be happening all at the same time, it can be hard to even take that moment, take that beat, take a step back and really kind of assess like what you're dealing with when you're really just trying to get from one moment to the next oftentimes. So we want to recognize that as well as like it can be tough to even do that much and just do your best when you can, but it can be helpful to really validate yourself within that. And when we say recognizing you're going through an adjustment or transition, like be careful not to downplay it either. I mean, unless that's helpful to you. Sometimes that is of like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. I can handle it. So it's not built up in your own mind of it becoming something bigger than it is. But sometimes we can invalidate ourselves too by kind of dismissing it when no, it's actually having a really big impact, even if it feels like it's a small change or adjustment of like my coffee place closed and I have to go to a new one. Like that
Right.
can be really hard. And some of our capacity with change is different. And so just recognizing how it's impacting you and just allowing it to, you're allowing yourself to process that and adjust in that way. Just acknowledging it can be helpful in that process.
And one of, I think, my favorite go-tos in acknowledging it is to name it to tame it. And I do feel like that's a lot of the work in therapy too, of like, let's name the many different transitions that you are going through. And I do like use my hands to like, you have this happening in your personal life, you have this going in your professional life, you have this happening in your parenting relationship, you have that, like, just to like, let's name all of the different things that you're currently like in flux with right now. And so the idea behind just being able to name it is to shine a light on that, to kind of tame the reactivity that you feel emotionally from that, of like, not that you're not going to feel anything. It's more of just to what you're saying. It's like, it's a validation. It's like that warm hug of like, okay, like I'm feeling something for a certain reason. And that can give me a little bit of clarity on kind of the next steps of like, what can I now, if anything, because sometimes there's not always like a next step to, is there something I can plan around with this change, or is there some sort of preparatory work that I can do? And even just recently in session, I found myself working with a client saying like, let's get all this out on paper and being like, this is happening over here, this is happening over here, let's write it all out of like, this is what I would hopefully want to have happen as a result of this. And like, draw it out, get it out of your head and onto paper to help kind of prepare for the next steps again, if there are any, because sometimes we just have to be able to like sit with it and process it too.
Yeah, definitely. I think the hope behind naming it to tame it is that when you make it more concrete, it makes it a little bit easier to see it and recognize it and deal with it.
Mhm.
Um, so instead of like a little more of an invisible dragon, if you will, if you can see the dragon, it's a little bit easier to kind of navigate how to slay it. But that's not always necessarily the case. And so, again, for some people, naming it might feel that much more overwhelming. Recognize that for yourself if that's the case. But I also appreciate the planning and preparing. If you're able to kind of assess what your needs are in that moment, which can be really hard on a regular day, let alone when you're in the middle of a transition. But if you can really ask yourself, like, what is it that I need in this moment? What is it that my loved ones need in this moment? What is it that we as a family need in this moment?
Mhm.
Or that my social network needs from me to know what I need? Just starting to ask those questions and starting to understand what those answers are so that you can hopefully find ways to squeeze those in, prepare for them, make sure that those are met to the best of your ability while you're going through this period. but also setting those realistic expectations too of like this is going to be challenging probably for a good chunk of time, if not a very prolonged period of time, and give yourself a lot of grace and compassion within that. And ideally, we can extend that to other people who are also dealing with the ripple effects as well, or dealing with it in similar, or dealing with a similar situation in different ways. For example, our significant other or a family member or fellow coworkers.
Right.
It's just maybe going to take some more time and allowing that to be okay, even if it's different from what you initially anticipated or hoped or wanted it to look like. That can be its own tough grief to go through as well in readjusting those expectations. That's okay too, but doing your best to really allow yourself, like it's going to take some time.
Yeah. And I think with kind of in that same camp of self-compassion is also just being flexible with yourself and others too, that, it's not in like, we're talking about change here, which is like, if I'm changing, like, I don't know exactly what to do at every step in that process. And so to try to be flexible with those expectations that you set with yourself or on others too, which again, it is kind of in being compassionate too, of like, you're not supposed to be able to figure it out on the spot. So let's be flexible with your timeline there. Let's be flexible with what that adaptation looks like. Let's get creative sometimes in kind of figuring out what you might need. So I think within that though, like we've kind of touched on this in different ways, but it's how can you be flexible with the routines that you do have in place? And I know, I've talked about the parenting stuff a lot already, but it's like even just right now, like back to school is starting. And I'm like, well, I need to be flexible that like this school year is going to be different than last school year, right? Like things that I've gotten really like set in. I need to be flexible because those things change. And it's such like it's something that happens every single year, right? But it's like, how can you look at your routines of like, I've gotten so good at this routine and I get really comfortable in that. To be like, how can I be flexible here? How can I stretch a little bit to find new routines or to kind of readjust what will actually like work better for you now at this stage, right? Because we're here now, not in the previous version.
Yeah, which again, in and of itself can be a really big challenge to figure out um, how to adjust, especially if you are pretty set in your routines and that brings you a lot of comfort and peace and security. It can be very, very challenging to figure out how you can be flexible and be forced into those processes sometimes by circumstance. And so being able to recognize like that's going to be an inherent need at times. It's not going to be easy necessarily, and that's okay if you're going to struggle with that. But recognizing that slowly edging towards creating a little more flexibility will probably be necessary and ultimately in the long run be helpful. And can help you in establishing some new routines based on the needs that you have in this moment rather than the ones that you had previously. And can help you focus on what you can control in this moment right here as well, rather than, the unknowns that may not be in your control, like coming back down to if you're feeling overwhelmed, what can you actually control in this moment? And what can you do that can actually be in your control and impact your own well-being or the situation that is within your control? Because there's so much that can't, and that's also often really challenging to consider. But focusing on what you can control, what you can do, what you can take action on can often be all that you can do and freeing in some ways.
Well, as you're just saying that, it makes me think of the just do the next right thing and whatever that might
Mm,
be. Sometimes it's just breaking it down into like, what is the next right thing in this state of overwhelm? The next right thing is I'm going to go get some water. And then
yeah.
after I drink some water, I'll go from there. So it can be just like getting this into as bite-sized pieces as well can be a helpful strategy. And then, of course, being a clinician, I think both of us would probably suggest that, you're not meant to try to do this all alone either. Maybe that you seek support from friends and family or colleagues. And also, I mean, there's professional support here too. I mean, like we've mentioned that's definitely a big part of our work is helping people navigate change, whether it be again, anticipated or unanticipated, just to help kind of sit with it sometimes and just hold space that, again, like, we're talking about specific strategies you can take, but there's also times that you have to just kind of process what that means, because as we went into today, there's so many different layers of this that do deserve space to really fully flush out the impact of what your experience is within this as well.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to kind of being in it and trying to get moment to moment, it can be helpful sometimes if you have a scheduled hour where you have dedicated time to actually process through what you're going through. You can sit down and kind of let it be something that you sit with rather than something that you're dealing with on a moment to moment basis. And so having that built in and scheduled to the point that you can't really get out of it can also be helpful. It's its own tool at times.
Mhm.
But you can also simulate that too with people in your support system. So definitely don't feel like you have to go through it alone. Reach out for support, whether it's for with a professional or with a friend or both,
Mhm.
with a trusted advisor, what have you. But don't feel like you have to do this alone.
Yeah. And, as we've hinted at a couple of times, like, even though change can be really hard and scary, unsettling, I think, one of the skills in therapy that we try to aim to do is the skill of reframe too, of like, if you find yourself, like I have many, many, many a time being like, I suck at change, or I'm not good at it, I don't like it, to just kind of pause and try it out if you can, to reframe that a little bit, to be like, you know what, growth is hard, change is hard, but I'm growing with the flow, I'm learning new things, I'm adjusting as we speak. And it's not trying to be overly positive about it, but just acknowledging that, change is hard. It doesn't mean that you're, maybe you don't feel good at it, but it doesn't mean that like there's something wrong with you. It is just in itself hard. And so trying to just kind of like catch how you talk to yourself too, I think can be a helpful reframe within this.
Yeah, absolutely. The reframe, if you're not familiar with reframes, which I feel like they're fairly common knowledge at this point, but just kind of twisting the frame and how we're looking at the picture a little bit is what we mean by reframe. And so, yeah, changing how you look at things, changing the meaning that you're assigning to this particular event whenever, and again, that step back kind of helps in being able to be intentionally in doing so. Um, but also just reminding ourselves that transitions, whether they're anticipated, whether they're unexpected, they are a part of life. Like Mandy said, they are changes the most constant that we have.
Mhm.
Um, and at the same time, kind of like you also said, Mandy, that, shifts and adjustments aren't necessarily a negative thing. Like they're very challenging and they're going to stretch us in ways that we maybe have not been stretched before and will continue to stretch us in those ways. But they can also be some of the most enriching processes and rewarding processes and result in things that really make our lives so much more purposeful and meaningful oftentimes. And I think both of our examples are examples of that,
Mhm.
amongst many, many others. And there's even in the negative instances, there's probably lessons of that within there once you're ready to look for them. And if that takes a minute or 15, that's totally fine too. But
Yeah.
uh, there can be those lessons within there too.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Well, I think we are transitioning now to the end, right?
I think so.
We're
Yeah.
wrapping up.
In our closing here, we'll have some resources, any that we can think of in the show notes, but were there any, what resources do we have, Mandy? We might have some additional
Well,
resources here,
yeah,
huh?
we're kind of trying something new out too. So we'd love to hear your feedback on this. One thing we were thinking would be helpful is that a lot of our sessions that we cover such, there's just such a variety of different topics, and our clinicians that are coming to these conversations with us, this time it being Sapna and I, but we thought it would be helpful to create a companion course, if you will, like a mini companion course that will basically like take the Cliff Notes versions of what we talked about, kind of the bullet points and some of the examples that we shared, and package it into a little course for you. So we're going to try that out with this one, since this, this was one of our longer episodes that we've had, because there's so much to talk about with adjustments. And even I found myself cutting off different things I wanted to talk about. So it gives us an opportunity to expand upon what we shared here, but then also share the things that we've talked about. And so we are going to have a companion course that will be around navigating adjustments and transitions too. So if this was something that intrigued you, or if this is something that you want to just be able to have a little bit of your own self-led follow-up, we're going to be working on getting that to you. And just, give us that follow on my Zession and stay in touch. And we also have our newsletter too, so we can put a link for that in the show notes, so that you can be apprised of those offerings that we're going to be sharing with you. So it won't be like a super long, and it's not gonna be like a course you get graded on. It'll just be there for supplement, just an additional mental health resource for you.
Yeah. Yep, as we try to do as much as we can here at Zession. Hopefully this could be another way to add a little extra support for y'all in this very, very dense and very long podcast, where we did cover a lot, but there's still only so much that we scratched the surface of. So thank y'all so much for joining us, and we'll be excited to talk to y'all again in the next episode.
Sounds good. Happy transitioning.